So I wasn't sure how many people on this call might have come to that one already, and we're hoping that it would be different today, or whether to expect most people to be here for the first time. So I guess the easiest way of dealing with that is to say, if you came to the last one, I will cover in the main the same stuff, though there is a little bit of extra information at the end that I've started working on. So you may want to do something in the background and sort of dip in and out. If you haven't seen this at all, then obviously all of this will be information for the first time. And eventually there will be a version of this training that's part of an EBSA toolkit, which we are in the process of developing for schools, which will be available as well. So you can watch the recorded version today or share it. I'm very happy for people to share it at twilight sessions, cascade it to other staff members. The last one that I ran, I have had people ask if it can be shared with parents. I don't personally have an issue with it being shared with parents, although it's not aimed at them. And I do hope eventually to tailor something more specifically to that group, but certainly I don't mind it being shared in the shorter term if you think that there's something valuable that will be helpful in your discussions with parents. So for those who don't know me, I'm Jenny Feeney. I'm the Senior Educational Psychologist in the Aylesbury Hub. I am also the current project lead for the EBSA project. The EBSA project is very, very new and developing, and I'm hoping that by the end of this academic year, there might be a bit more information for schools and you know what that means. But currently, at the moment, we're in the process of developing a toolkit, lots of guidance for schools to mirror that which is available through other local authorities, and also working on a pathway from early intervention through to targeted support for families where EBSA is very entrenched. OK, so having said that it's a good idea to keep general questions to the end, if I say something that somebody doesn't understand, please feel free to unmute yourself and just shout up and say, Jenny, can you just explain that a little bit better? It's the end of the day. I went off for 2 weeks for Easter, so I forgot how to talk. So I'm perfectly willing to believe that I might not always explain myself clearly. So don't worry about interrupting. OK, so if I put this up, Vicky, can you just tell me that you can see that? OK, brilliant. Yeah. And when I'm in PowerPoint mode, I can't see hands up or anything. So Vicky, if you just sort of manage that and let me know if there's anything to pause for. I'm not going to show this video today, but when I'm happy to send the PowerPoint out, or if you just Google this, School is Not My Enemy, it's quite a nice representation of what EBSA feels like for a young person. The reason that I've embedded it here is that sometimes in my work with families, I suggest that parents or school maybe share this with their child, because the experience of EBSA is incredibly isolating. Often children think, I look at everyone else and nobody else seems to be having this problem that I'm having. And so looking for resources that help them to feel that they're not alone in this situation can be helpful. And this is a nice visual representation rather than having to read information that can be very detailed. So if you just Google School is Not My Enemy, you will find it, but I will also send out the PowerPoint via Vicky, and then you'll be able to click on the link within it. Oh no, it keeps trying to play. There we go. So in terms of the learning objectives for today, I know that the session is entitled something like Attendance and Reintegration. It was entitled that when we did it within ISEND as well, and I did say at that time it is too big a topic to cover all the way from start to finish in a single session. So the primary focus for today will be on the sort of the earlier end of that. And so the learning objectives, as far as I can see, are to understand the nature and the scope of the issue of EBSA, to investigate the risk and protective factors that are related to both how EBSA begins and how it is maintained, and to consider the proactive role that schools can play in helping to achieve positive outcomes for those who are displaying emotional-based school avoidance. OK, so I'm going to start by talking about what we actually mean by EBSA. I don't want to assume that people know what we mean, and it's also important to emphasise a couple of points. So first of all, I think the thing that schools staff need to remember is that it is a descriptive term. It's not a diagnosis. I make this point because I think quite often schools can feel disempowered and feel like they don't have the skills to be able to address particular needs. And so when something comes along that seems like it's new on the scene, and as Vicky said, it isn't new. This has been around, forever. It's just that we started talking about it in a different way. I sometimes feel that then there's a loss of confidence in people in terms of how do I actually approach this. So EBSA is not like having autism where there are specific criteria and specific underlying difficulties. It is a general description to describe children who have significant and persistent challenges in attending school. That's all that it means. And it relates to specifically to emotional needs, not to contextual factors. So for example, you might have a child who is not able to attend for a shorter term period because of some significant life event. We wouldn't consider that to be EBSA in the same way. It's to do with the underlying emotional difficulties. We used to call it school refusal, so that's why, as Vicky said, you know, it's been around, but we changed how we speak about it. The reason that we don't call it school refusal anymore, although you will find some resources are still, you know, use that terminology because they've been around for a while, is to specifically acknowledge some elements of how children with EBSA present. So first of all, we want to move away from the language of control and blame. When we talk about school refusal, it makes it sound like the young person has a choice, that they have decided that I am not going to attend school. Whereas for the majority of children, being able to, you know, avoiding school is the only necessary behavior. I'll say that again. Avoiding school is the only tool that a child has to be able to manage their needs. So they don't have other alternatives. This is all that they can do to protect themselves. It also implies that they don't want to attend, and that's generally not the case. Now, I'm not saying I've never worked with children who will say, you know, actually, I don't want to go to school. But in the majority of cases, children who we work with say that they do actually want to be able to attend school, but they can't. And I would still suggest that even at those who say that they don't want to, that is somewhat of a defence mechanism against a situation that they find themselves in. It blames the child rather than being curious about the environmental factors that might impact on school, on not attending school. So it's saying this is the child's choice rather than saying this child isn't getting sufficient support in reference to X, Y, and Z, and therefore they can't attend. When children are out of school, the emotional needs do not go away. So, you know, acknowledging that it isn't choice again, but saying this is a persistent emotional need that a child has, and this is just a behaviour that is associated with it, is important. And it's a complex interplay of child, home and school factors. In no cases do we ever find that the presenting factors relate only to the child and the child's needs. So within EBSA, we are always making an assumption that it is something to do with what is happening for the child and what is happening in the school setting and what is happening in the home setting. Okay. We love to talk about a spectrum as psychologists, as I'm sure you're aware, so I'm sorry to throw the term in there again. When we talk about EBSA, I think it is important to say that we shouldn't only focus on the children who are already chronically non-attending. Obviously, those are the children who causes a great deal of anxiety as professionals because clearly, you know, it's already a very difficult, entrenched situation. It can be very difficult to break and move on. There are often very complicating factors that lead to very persistent and chronic non-attendance. But we can usually see earlier signs that children are experiencing distress around attendance. So whether it's parents reporting that I'm really struggling to get them ready in the morning, you know, they wake up and the first thing that they tell me is I don't really want to go to school today. Feeling unwell is incredibly important. So monitoring things like sickness, headaches and stomach upsets in particular, which are common anxiety related symptoms. And in the secondary phase in particular, we might see it in terms of children managing to miss particular lessons. So either, you know, managing to get themselves out of PE lessons because they haven't brought their PE kit with them, or their parent has signed a note to say that they can't attend that day. They're managing to get themselves kicked out of science lesson in particular, or something on those lines. So some children will continually attend, but they experience daily fear and anxiety, and we should, as far as I'm concerned, consider those children to be EBSA cases as well. So we're looking at it and saying it's great that they have managed to get here today, but actually, you know, we can see that there's a huge amount of anxiety which is related to being in the school context. And for some children, they may have just sufficient resilience and they may be well supported within the school. So actually, you're a very nurturing setting. You are putting a lot of support in place quite intuitively for this child. And so they are able to attend. But again, that doesn't mean that those experiences that underlie EBSA are not there. So the child is still struggling, but you are managing to get it to the point that they are able to be successful and attend in spite of what they are experiencing. So from research, researchers have tried to define EBSA as being from occasional avoidance to intermittent avoidance, all the way through to complete avoidance. Now, the difficulty is with having these different ways of viewing EBSA, that we can underestimate the prevalence of it. So when you're thinking about how many children in my school might need additional support in reference to EBSA, we're talking about between 1% and 5% of children experiencing EBSA at any one time within a school population. So 1% at the lower end, a conservative estimate, is probably looking at those chronic non-attenders. You're going up to 5% is taking into account children who are showing earlier signs of EBSA within the research literature. It affects somewhere between 5% and 28% of children at some point. Obviously, that's a massive range, and that very much takes into account the fact that if researchers say, I'm not only going to look at the children who aren't attending actively, but I'm going to research including children who regularly feel upset about going to school, complain of psychosomatic symptoms, etc., then you get up towards your 28% of children. We know that it peaks around transition to secondary school. So, we always see a flurry within SEN of applications for education healthcare plans around that transition to secondary school. And I think in quite a lot of those cases, I can see that some of the concerns do relate to emotional-based school avoidance. Actually, we've managed to help this child keep things together at this point because the stresses within our system aren't so great as the potential stresses within the secondary system. So we really want to make sure that we're thinking about planning early enough for that transition for children who are at risk of becoming school avoidant. We see higher rates, therefore, in secondary school. Needs are often missed until they're actually chronic. If we start thinking about our electively home educated population, I know which doesn't, as school practitioners, that's probably doesn't matter so much for you, but this is designed for people supporting other families. We would assume that there is an overrepresentation of children whose parents decide to electively home educate them because their children are suffering from significant anxiety within the school context. And therefore the need is hidden from local authority provision, etc., and getting support that people might need. Some people's parents also report feeling that there was pressure placed on them to decide to electively home educate because their children were experiencing anxiety. So just thinking about how we support parents to feel that we can meet needs alongside them as partners is very important. There are several clinical diagnoses which are commonly linked. So separation anxiety is something we talk a lot more about in the early years and sometimes gets a bit missed and forgotten as children develop, as if it isn't present because they are an older child. That's not true. Separation anxiety can be apparent across the age range. General anxiety disorders and ODD and ASD are overrepresented within this group. And this is just an interesting point to say that 10% of the school population in 2018 to 19 had no recorded reason for absences. So it may well be that we should be looking at, much larger numbers than those initial 1% to 5% would suggest. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we mean as psychologists by anxiety, not to be patronising, but to make sure that we're talking about it in the clinical sense rather than in the sort of common everyday use of the word. Anxiety is so common in EBSA that you could see it as a defining characteristic. There is some argument about this. Not all people want to believe that, particularly when I talk to parents of children who are on the autistic spectrum in particular, sometimes take umbrage with this, but research shows us that anxiety is incredibly prevalent within this population. And so some researchers have actually started calling it anxiety-based school avoidance instead. How that presents may differ as a function of language capacity and child development. So for some children, if they're able to give us a verbal account of their anxieties and emotions, it can be very obvious that, you know, anxiety is the presenting difficulty here, and the behaviour that comes out is school avoidance. But for other children who aren't able either to communicate that in terms of their special educational needs or their level of development, we may have to interpret other signs that anxiety is present for a child. So aggression in the face of what they consider to be a threatening situation. So in some cases, parents will report that in the home setting in particular, trying to get the child ready for school, they have situations where the child is barricading themselves into their room. They're very aggressive, maybe they're hitting parents, maybe they're trying to block them from being able to engage with them. And the other signs, as I mentioned previously, are our physiological symptoms, what we often refer to as psychosomatic. So headaches, stomach aches, feelings of dread, sweating, shaking, and racing heart. Just to make a note on that, psychosomatic doesn't mean that something isn't real. I think sometimes people think that psychosomatic means that it's sort of in your head. And what it actually means is it's a physical representation of a psychological concept. So it is real. If a child tells us that they have a stomach ache, it isn't them, you know, trying to say something to us in a different way. It's genuine. As far as that child is concerned, they have a stomach ache. If they are relatively emotionally literate, they might be able to make the connection to saying, and that is maybe because I'm feeling a bit worried. But for other children who can't make that connection, as far as they're concerned, this is no different to a stomach ache that, you know, presents through other physiological needs. And so up to 80% of children experience psychosomatic symptoms, which aren't necessarily correlated with other forms of non-attendance, and illnesses often disappear as soon as the immediate stressors are removed. So if you have situations where children have frequent headaches and stomach aches and parents report that they're absolutely fine when they're at home, then again, that says to me it is anxiety based, because what's happened is I've taken away the stressor and therefore that's why the illness disappeared. Whereas if you had a headache or a stomach ache that was caused by other physiological reasons, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to happen in the same way. So it can be a good indicator. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, I think, so I'm not going to dwell on it for too long, but there are common factors which we know are more likely to lead to EBSA in different children. So just pick a couple of them out. A family of history of EBSA is a significant one. So it's often the case that if you have one child who you've worked with who struggled with their attendance, that will become a pattern, and other siblings within the family will also find it difficult. Physical illness is a big indicator for being at risk of presenting with EBSA. And just pick another one, children who have anxieties around exams or difficult peer relationships and staff relationships in school. As I said, I will come back to this a little bit later. Okay, and I want to just play this for you briefly, hopefully. I've got to remember how to make it work so that you can actually hear the sound. There we go. So this is something that can be helpful to play for people in things like Twilights, to show them what we mean by anxiety and the anxiety cycle. And I'll talk to it in a second for you. Vicky, if this doesn't work or you can't hear the sound, can you let me know?
The human mind has evolved to think in such a way that it naturally creates psychological suffering. You see, back in the Stone Age, 200,000 years ago, life was pretty dangerous for our caveman ancestors. So if a caveman or cavewoman wanted to survive, their minds had to constantly be on the lookout for things that might hurt or harm them. And if that cave person's mind wasn't good at predicting, spotting, or avoiding danger, what happened to her? The default setting of the caveman mind was safety first, and we in the modern world have inherited this. Our modern minds are constantly warning us of things that might hurt or harm us. The caveman mind says, watch out, there might be a bear in that cave, you could get eaten. Watch out, that shadow on the horizon might be an enemy from another clan, you could get speared. Our modern mind then does worrying, predicting the worst, avoiding anything that scares you, anxiety in all of its different forms. Back in caveman days, you survive an encounter with a bear or a wolf, then it's useful to replay it. It's useful for your mind to go over the events and remember what you did to survive so that you're better prepared for next time. But in our modern world, we go over and over painful memories, dwelling on them, reliving them, even when there's nothing useful to learn or the lesson has been well and truly learned a long time ago. In the Stone Age era, as a caveman or cavewoman, you have to fit in with the group. If you are alone, you will soon die. So your mind compares you to others in the group. Am I fitting in? Am I contributing enough? Am I following the rules? Am I doing anything that might get me thrown out? Now, in modern life, we're always comparing ourselves to others. But the problem is we're no longer in a small group. Our groups are enormous today, and we carry with us devices that constantly feed us images and stories of people all over the planet. This constant comparison ramps up our fear of being judged or rejected or not fitting in or just not being good enough. The caveman mind tells you you need more food, you need more water, better weapons, better shelter. The cave people who thought this way lived longer and had more offspring. Unfortunately, in the modern world, this manifests as greed, dissatisfaction, craving, wanting. It's never enough. I need more, more, more. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, these Stone Age thought patterns are intensified by the sheer pace and complexity of modern life. Our frantic existence, rushing from task to task, that never-ending to-do list. So when your mind starts doing this unhelpful stuff, as all minds do, remember it's not defective or abnormal, and it's not deliberately trying to make your life difficult. It's simply doing the job it has evolved to do, trying to keep you safe and save you from pain.
Okay, I apologise for the sound in the background. I think they're coming out of school next door. Okay, so I have used this video quite successfully with young people as well as practitioners to help them to understand what anxiety is, why it's there, and to help them to think about how it impacts on their lives. So you may consider sharing that with some of your students if they're older and more able to engage with the language within it. Let's think about how anxiety then relates to EBSA specifically. So start with the idea that emotions are functional. So anxiety is to push yourself, to help you to explore safely. The issue with any of our emotions is whether or not they become severe and intrusive, not the fact that they exist in the first place. And when we become anxious, we can become trapped in a cycle of thoughts and behaviours that then end up maintaining that anxiety. And I'll talk this in more detail in a second. But first of all, we're primed to notice things, as the video said. That's how we keep ourselves safe. When we notice danger, it elicits thoughts and feelings that we may then seek to avoid, which does give us brief relief. But during that relief period, our anxiety does not disappear, and in fact it can actually grow because of our unhealthy, our negative thought patterns, which have developed and evolved over time and can be useful in some places, but not in others. So I will talk that through in detail for you. So if we have an anxiety cycle, so we've got a child who's starting to experience some negative thoughts and feelings, how does that then grow to the point that we end up with patterns of avoidance? So children may experience a variety of negative thoughts that are personal to them. So we're not saying that there are specific patterns which all children will present with, and actually getting to know them as individuals is important in terms of intervention. So for one child, it might be, I don't think that people like me. I'm really bad at this. My teacher doesn't even know who I am. So those kind of thoughts, which are probably normal in that most people will experience those kind of thoughts at some point in their life, even on a regular basis. But maybe for the majority of us, we're able to then put that into context, look at the evidence around us and say, actually, I don't think people don't like me because this person seems to be okay with me. And we start to build up a sense of resilience and be able to pay less attention to those thoughts, which are there to protect us, but we challenge them appropriately and go, I don't think I need to worry about that. I can put that worry away. So for some children, though, they have these thoughts and feelings, and our brains have evolved shortcuts to keep us safe, but which lead to distortions. So one thing we do is that we ruminate on them. So as the video said, if you've had an encounter with a wolf, it's really helpful to keep thinking about what happened, why did that happen, is the same going to happen again? Put that in this modern context and somebody thinking people don't like me, we end up in a pattern where we ruminate on them too much. We spend a lot of time thinking about it. Why don't people like me? Oh, that happened the other day and I can't stop thinking about it. Why did they laugh? Why were those two girls in the picture laughing? Were they laughing at me? I think they must have been laughing at me. We then selectively look for evidence that our ideas are true. That is how our brain is programmed to work. It's a very useful shortcut in lots of areas of learning, but not helpful here. So we call this cognitive distortion or selective abstraction or even mental filters. So I already think that people don't like me. When I'm in the playground, I see these two girls laughing and I selectively see that as reinforcing what I believe, rather than noticing that that kid over there is actually smiling at me and that one asked me to play with them. I get fixated on the fact that I saw these two girls laughing and I think it was something about me. Fixating on them then leads us to escalate the level of threat or uncertainty. We call this magnification or catastrophization. It's the worst thing ever. We overgeneralize it. So everyone must think that I'm really stupid and ugly and horrible. And we also then tend to personalize events as well. So we see random events as being linked to something personal to us. So my teacher dropped my book in a puddle, and that must be because, the whole world hates me, not just because my teacher doesn't like me. So by not being involved in school, by avoiding it, this is how our anxiety actually grows. So we were already feeling worried about school and that people didn't like us and we weren't very clever. That led to us then thinking the only way I can really avoid how awful that makes me feel is to stay away from school. And then when you're not in school, these thoughts and feelings escalate through these kind of faulty thought processes. So if we lack the resources and strategies to manage extreme feelings, we avoid them. If it's really awful, how horrible it makes you feel that you think people hate you, you feel sick every day, you feel shaky and nervous and you can't stop thinking about it, it's probably legitimate to think I'm not going to go to school tomorrow because it makes me feel absolutely dreadful and exhausted and I can't cope with it. So that allows you some temporary respite. The relief is only short term. It goes unchallenged. The anxiety escalates. So next time it feels worse, you feel like you can't cope. And then you start making predictions about the worst case scenario. Oh, it's going to be awful if I go back to school. Everyone's going to be looking at me and they're going to be laughing at me and thinking that, I'm an idiot. And our avoidance confirms to the child that school really isn't a safe place. And it's only by then breaking that cycle that we can actually stop avoidance becoming entrenched. We need to help people to see that things can be okay when you're at school, to start to then dissipate all of those negative thoughts and feelings that are associated with it. It's also important to remember that over time, the primary factors for avoidance become only part of the picture. So if you have a child who has low self-esteem or difficulties in friendships, but actually are very academically able, whilst the primary factor for avoiding school might be those social interaction or those esteem needs, over time, secondary factors can then actually exacerbate the feelings of anxiety. So because they're not attending school, they do begin to fall behind on their schoolwork. And so that also then becomes part of their anxiety, that they're not good enough and they're going to fail, etc. Losing friends and having increased isolation means that their peer relationships are more likely to be difficult, even if they do attend. And there are also other factors that can maintain it, including enjoying being at home. So actually, it's so relieving when I'm at home. I have a really nice time. I feel relaxed. People don't bother me. I've got my stuff around me that helps me to feel anchored and safe, etc. and therefore there's a decrease in motivation to engage with the school system. Okay, so that's a very whirlwind tour in terms of what anxiety is, because it is only a short training session, but I'm putting together more resources to help people to understand this in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to make sure I had time to get on to think about what you can actually do as schools as well. So how do we reduce the impact of EBSA? This quote is taken from a researcher who's a big name within EBSA. So he says that EBSA occurs when stress exceeds support, when risks are greater than resilience, and when pull factors that promote non-attendance overcome the push factors that encourage attendance. This quote is important to me because it's how you should structure your approach to working with children and young people, and I'll try to explain that in more detail in the next few slides. Okay, I didn't quite get time to do this. I wanted to draw you a good upside down pyramid, which I'm sure is something that you're familiar with as a concept in terms of special educational needs. We always worry about the cases at the top end of the pyramid, the children who are really difficult to reach, who are already in a significant amount of distress, etc. But I really want to get schools to think about, what are you doing for all the other children? Because those children are likely to need a multi-agency response and a significant amount of support, etc. And it may well be for some of those cases, it does end up being more specialist than you're able to work with as a setting. But there is a whole lot of stuff that you can do, both to prevent EBSA from happening and to make intervention at the earlier stages, or to support the children who aren't at that kind of very significant level, but certainly are, showing us with their behaviour that they do need some support. So this is only going to be a fairly whirlwind tour. And I've tried to put in some links that might be interesting to follow up later. What I'm in the process of developing through the EBSA project is a toolkit where it will structure some of this for you to say, OK, this is a situation we find ourselves in as a school. We recognise that maybe we're not doing great at the whole ethos end of thinking about anxiety in school. Here are some resources that I can go and click on and think about how we can deploy support in our school. So this is kind of an introduction to what the toolkit will eventually look like, hopefully. So in terms of prevention, I'm probably not going to say anything to you which is entirely radical and new, and I don't want to. In fact, I really spend a lot of time trying to help schools to feel that this is already something that they know how to do. It's just remembering that this does apply to this small percentage of pupils, in particular. And any whole school approach which promotes things like emotional literacy, resilience, belongingness, flexibility in thinking, or metacognition are all relevant to reducing the kinds of needs that children who then present with EBSA have. So it doesn't need to be a very specific resource. I'm not saying that advocating for one over another, but I have put some links in to help you think about this. But think about, what are you offering in your school that promotes emotional literacy? So emotional literacy, just to be clear what I mean by that, is that making that connection to this stomach ache. I've noticed it, it feels unpleasant, I don't like it, it affects my behaviour. I've noticed that it happens more often in these situations, and therefore maybe it means that I'm worried, and maybe I'm worried about exams because I find them very stressful. And what I'm going to do to be able to manage that is put these self-regulation strategies in place. That's an incredibly emotionally literate person who can go through all of those stages. So supporting children to develop any of those skills within your whole school approach is important. And if it's not at the whole school level in terms of something that everybody does every day, it's just thinking about what embedded provision do you have for children who are either at the kind of ordinary available provision level, or children who are just at the emerging special educational needs level. Resilience is that capacity to be able to keep on doing something even though it's challenging and unpleasant, etc. And there are lots of interventions which are available to help schools think about how they promote resilience. Belongingness, as it sounds, is a sense that you are part of your school community, that you belong there, that you are an important part of it, and people would miss you if you were not there. And so again, there are plenty of things that we can do to ensure that we're promoting at the whole school level. And flexibility and metacognition are important in terms of self-regulation skills as well. So actually noticing your thought processes and how they work at a kind of level that is slightly removed. I would also suggest, I don't actually know who the makeup of the audience is here, so I'm not sure if we've got any senior school leaders, but if not, maybe it's about talking to them to say it would be helpful to specifically go out of your way to audit your whole school provision and your ethos. And the West Sussex guidance contains, I couldn't get a direct link to it because it's a download, but if you click on that link, it will take you to like a contents page. And within that, there's something called whole school audit. And it just gets you to go through and think about, do we have the right systems in place to promote, emotional well-being and reduce anxiety within our setting? And in addition to that, it's just encouraging schools to say you should be engaging in dialogue with your students about how they feel in school, look at things like whether or not the physical and sensory layout is ideal for both your neurotypical and neuroatypical students. So I've just given you a link to the, I think it's from the Autism Education Trust, the sensory audit tool that you could use to think about the physical environment and how that impacts on people who have higher sensory needs. And also asking your students on a regular basis how supported they feel in lessons, checking that they actually have knowledge of how to access help, because frequently these are children who find it difficult to articulate their needs and recognise that the support is available to them. And also think about their social interactional needs and inclusion. Probably a slightly harder sell, but I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to put it in there anyway. I've listed sociograms and belongingness scales. We can often make judgments from our own experiences in terms of whether or not we feel that others are enjoying social inclusion to its fullest sense. And I would highly recommend using actual audit tools which are evidence-based to help you to track that rather than making judgments externally. So sociograms are tools which, based on asking children which are the students in their class they like to spend time with, and you can use it to create a digital map of children who are socially isolated compared to other children. There are also things like the belongingness scale, which belongs to the Nora Fredrickson's advice that was produced probably about 15 years ago now, but it's still very good. I think it's called the Educational Psychology Portfolio or something along those lines, but schools are able to access. I can follow that up with a link in due course. And again, so after prevention, early identification is obviously incredibly important. There's not a huge amount out there currently to help you to think about this. I'm being a little bit creative and kind of pulling bits and pieces that I found in other places. But the emotionally based school avoidance guidance from Staffordshire, if you look at page 41 to 45, has a number of sort of tick boxes that you could use which focus on the vulnerability factors for EBSA. So my thinking is that if you use that for a whole school questionnaire, then you would be able to acknowledge and find the children who are more likely to require support in this domain. In terms of early identification, I was discussing this with a school earlier today, is then giving consideration to whether or not the child should be on the SEN register. Now, I'm a psychologist and I'm going to come at this very much from my own profession and not worry about the implications for you guys, but you obviously need to think about it a little bit in terms of how you deploy resources. I know that the Code of Practice describes special education, being on the Special Educational Needs Register relating to a resource implication. However, I think for some of these children in the earlier stages, it's likely that there isn't going to be a resource implication. It's maybe reasonable adjustment, monitoring, maybe a small amount of provision which is ordinarily available within your wider school setting. But early identification and placing them on the SEN register for me would reduce complications down the line. We have a lot of children who get escalated all the way to EHCP without ever having been on an SEN plan in the first place. And so that graduated response isn't actually happening because we're not monitoring and tracking what's happening for children in the earlier stages. I think this is often the case because the needs don't always present within the school setting. So frequently the narrative around these cases is the child is okay in school, we don't even need to give them any SEN support, and the parents are saying my child is coming home, having huge meltdowns, is absolutely exhausted, tearful, suffering from psychosomatic symptoms, etc. So by using those kind of audit tools to identify who is vulnerable, my hope is that you then start to identify children who should be on the SEN register at the earlier stages before the point that it's already entrenched EBSA and they're voting with their feet and not attending. Okay, I think I've said that already. Okay, so then thinking about work with vulnerable pupils, I hope there will be a great deal of information available to you on this by the end of the school term, but for the time being, I have put some bits and pieces in from other websites that might be useful. We need to start by seeing avoidance as functional and consider the questions in planning, the following questions in planning and conversations with children and parents and teachers. What I mean by functional is that stop seeing it as emotion and think about what is the problem that it's trying to solve, what is the function of this behaviour. So if avoiding school is the solution, what's the problem for this child? What outcome has been achieved by them not attending? So what are they getting by not attending that they're not getting when they're in school? What do the behaviours tell us about what a young person is thinking or feeling? And what do they tell us about what that young person may then need? You need to remember that it is a behaviour. You're not being asked to be an expert in EBSA as such. It very much is, to me, relational work. It's about knowing the individual child, getting alongside them. If they're not able to articulate at this point in time to us what is happening for them, all they know is that they don't want to attend school, maybe we have to be, the scientists or the detectives. We have to think about what could be bothering them and learn through sort of trial and intervention and working closely with that child to see whether or not that actually fits. In order to do that, a couple of tools which I think are potentially useful are, put in there, the school refusal scales, unfortunately named under the old research terminology, so always give parents and children a big apology for the fact that's how it's described, that's not what we think, etc., etc. But the point of the scales, and they're freely accessible online through that link there, is that they map out what is commonly challenging for children who experience EBSA, and sometimes by starting from that point it can then open up a conversation about other things that a child hasn't been able to tell us. It's much easier for a child to say, yes, that does happen to me, or no, that does not happen to me, than for them to answer the question, why don't you like coming to school? That's a huge question, and for some children they're nowhere near the point of being able to explain that to somebody. They may not even really be aware of it themselves. So the scales can be a helpful starting point. I think I've linked one of them for you there, but there's actually a child and a parent version, depending on the developmental stage of the child, whether or not they'd be able to respond to the child version, but the parent one is also very helpful to start with. And again, within the Staffordshire advice, if you go to pages 49 to 56, because it's quite a long document, there are a few different sort of pro formas or worksheets almost for mapping out the needs that often underpin EBSA, helping parents and schools to think about what is pushing them from school, what is pulling them towards home. It can also be helpful for schools to frame it in this way when talking to parents, because often both school and home are quite invested in defending their position that it's not, the problem doesn't lie with them in some way. And I always come in at the start and gently challenge that at both ends and say it's probably both. It's unlikely to be in one setting or the other. And so having conversations about pushing and pulling is incredibly important in terms of making sure that we're getting our support right for children. Time check. Okay, to make sure I leave time for questions, so I will just finish quickly. So the last couple of points on here, we're just thinking about those kind of risk factors. So if we know that there are things that are pulling them towards the home setting, so dysfunctional family interaction is listed here, bereavements, those kind of things, no one is suggesting that as a school you're going to be able to address that overnight, and it may well not be within your remit to address it at all. It's maybe it's a social care threshold or the family working with family support, but think about making sure that you have signposts in that direction. But I just want people to pull people back to thinking about risk and resilience models. If that's something that you haven't heard about before, by all means, go away, do a bit of reading. There'll be tons of stuff online, or come back to me and I'm happy to explain it in a little bit more detail. But where we are faced with a position that we're not going to be able to change an immediate situation for a child, what we should do instead of thinking about how do we reduce that risk factor because it's there and it's present and I can't change it, is thinking about how instead we promote resilience as a buffer to that situation. And there are lots of things that we can do in school. So if there's a very difficult family dynamic, that's not going to change immediately overnight. What you can do is look at how you develop feelings of feelings of safety, security, and a sense of belonging in the school setting. How do you help a young person to develop ambition, etc.? The way that it's set out within the Suffolk guidance is helpful as far as I'm concerned, because it would then help you with your SEN planning to say, here is the risk that we've identified, here is therefore what we are doing, and that then informs any SEN planning that might need to happen for this child. Very last thoughts, and then I'll give a few minutes for questions. Things that frequently come up in consultations with schools, parents, family support workers, social workers, various people who contact me, is thinking about how absences are being coded. That's a huge topic in itself, so I'm not going to spend any great deal of time talking about it now. I guess my plea to you all as practitioners is to be open and honest about that decision making and not be afraid of it. The guidance for schools is pretty thin. It says that you should only code something as unauthorised if you doubt the veracity of the claim that the child is too unwell to attend. If you do doubt the veracity of that claim, that says to me that you have safeguarding concerns or otherwise. We should be clear with parents that that is, the position, so that we're clear what therefore are the steps that are going to be taken. All too often, I find that schools and parents have got to a position where they're not entirely clear why those decisions have been made. Maybe they've been informed by guidance from third parties, etc. And as far as I'm concerned, as I said, it's about being open and honest and therefore thinking about what are the next steps in terms of this. Make sure that you're clear as a school in terms of what your responsibilities are around provision for children who are not attending. If you are coding it as illness, you have responsibilities in terms of making provision. If you are not coding them as authorised, but you do actually believe that the child is struggling to attend school, I would ask why you're not making some form of provision to support a child. But again, a lot of this is to do with legal frameworks, etc. And I can only advise as a professional. And also think about, have we got to the point where we need to seek an alternative? If this child is not going to return in the immediate future, what then is our plan to ensure that those secondary maintaining factors don't develop? They don't then miss out on an education that they're entitled to. They don't fall behind more significantly than they need to. I'm not suggesting that any of those things are straightforward. They're complicated, they're hard to advise on. It usually comes through a lot of discussion with various people. But please do use things like the EBSA drop-in sessions, which I've just started up, so it's not that you've missed them before. Up until this point, I've just been allowing people to contact me and ask for advice, and we've slotted time in. Because I get asked by so many people, I've decided to put some upfront sessions in on a Friday morning. I have 2 half-hour slots upfront. It doesn't mean I can't do anything outside those time periods, but they're always there in case anybody wants to sign up for something and say, could I just drop in and have a quick chat with you about this situation, whether or not we're going in the right direction. And in the longer term, as I said, there will be hopefully a proper pathway in place. I'm hoping by September, so that you will know when to escalate something to a different level. Okay, show there. I did try. There we go. I did try very hard to finish early enough to give a bit more time for questions, but that always is a bit of an issue. I'm happy to hang on longer than the next 5 minutes if needed. But in the meantime, do you want to stop the recording for questions, Vicky?